many of these Japanese companies, to us anyway, are kind of creating the future, not only for them, but a future that we can see through them that may be our own future. So that's why we wrote the book, wanted to tell the story in Japan. People in Japan know the story, so this is really not for people who are living it. It really is for people who want to think about their own leadership, their own firm, and how they too, just like these Japanese, turnaround, resolute new leaders in Japan have turned around many companies there.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today.
Well, we know that Japan is an extremely important economy on a global scale, and it has also had a very unique corporate leadership style with its largest companies and within its government. But a new book looks at the shift going on within the country in regards to that leadership model and why there are changes afoot right now, and they are leading to an amazing comeback. Pleasure to be joined here in studio by Wharton's Harbir Singh and Mike Useem. They are part of the author trio of the new book, Resolute Japan, The Leaders Forging a Corporate Resurgence. Great to see you both. Great to have you in studio.
Dan, thanks for having us.
So let's start with what happened and why did it happen, Harbir?
So this is just to acknowledge our third author, Professor Ikegami from Waseda University. The Japan kind of was at its peak in the stock market in the late 80s, and after that it began to decline, and many people thought that the argument was that the companies had kind of were wedded to the manufacturing model, which was a total quality movement and so on, but not as much in services and information technology-based businesses and so on. And what we've seen in the resurgence now is really a discovery on the part of these several corporations leaders that they need to pivot to technology-based industries, gaming, media, and they have to adapt the model. And so what they did was they actually brought in processes that they saw in various parts of the world and incorporated them into the Japanese model, retaining the process discipline. So you have this idea of, pivoting into new industries, creating a sense of tolerance for failure, but also entrepreneurial activity, which is a huge shift for them. And also then understanding that you cannot have the same hierarchies as you had before. You had to have a flatter organization, and that leaders needed to be more approachable and be more informal and seek ideas from the middle of the organization and the lower levels in the organization and bring a sense of ferment and exploration in these companies. And the best performance, it so happened we were studying models of management and trying to understand what's unique about Japanese headquartered firms. Many of them are global. And we found that there were four elements. The first one was really a question of a stakeholder view of the firm, that the firm is more than just responsible to shareholders. It's responsible to customers, employees, shareholders, and communities. But importantly, it's a flywheel. They reinforce each other. And that sense of momentum is what they were trying to bring in the current reality. And the second part was the idea of learning for the long run, leading for the long run, more like 10 to 15 years. So they retained that principle. And the third one was exploration versus exploitation, really enhancing the exploration piece and allowing for some internal venture capital. And the fourth one was really addressing inspiration of employees and bringing a sense of empowerment into the organization and really following what we've seen in the tech world here. So that blend, really a hybrid of modern management techniques in many parts of the world and the traditional Japanese model is what we call the hybrid leadership model that they came up with. And I know Mike will have a lot more to say.
I think I would just add, Dan, that we went into this study of Japanese top management on the premise that Japan was languishing, and it was for a couple decades. Just to go back a little bit on the history of Japanese business, in the 60s and 70s, Japan around the world became known as number one. They're hugely successful companies, not just in automaking, but just about everything, including banking. And a professional colleague wrote a book called Japan Was Number One, which aptly described many of the methods that had carried them well through the 70s and then through the 80s. But around 1990, Japan kind of went off a cliff, and for the last 3 decades, it's been kind of in retreat. And a summary, picking up on what Harbir said there, the 4 specific points, I think is captured by a phrase that comes from a very well-known executive coach, Marshall Goldsmith. It's a great phrase. I'm going to take it out of context. He uses it in a slightly different way than I'm going to reference it here. But he basically has said that as you look at careers develop, what got you to where you are won't get you, what got you here won't get you there the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that's what happened in Japan. What got them to this Japan is number one status, worldwide best practice. Everybody wanted to be like Japanese companies, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Toyota, and so on. And I think picking up on the particulars that Harbir just offered up, over the last 20 years, or the last 30 years, really, sometimes now referred to as the lost 30s, over 30 years, Japanese companies languishing because it's taken that long, believe it or not, to shake off what was serving them well back in the 70s and 80s in favor of a new set of principles for leading big companies.
Well, and I guess, from the outside looking in, Harbir, you hear the stories about, and you kind of alluded to, not accepting failure. That's one of the components that you hear was legendary within kind of the Japanese structure for such a long period of time. I'm sure they don't accept failure, but they kind of moderate with it now that failure is kind of a component in business, but you can become better off of it, correct?
Yes, so exactly right. And it is very much ingrained in the societal culture and history, that failure is not an option. And that goes very far in process discipline. And many companies explicitly created a sort of a context in which you could experiment, and if it didn't work, you pivot. So they kind of got into this idea of pivoting and the idea of agility. So a company called Asahi Glass, which was number one in glass in the world, found that the glass industry was commoditizing, and so they needed to get into some other things. So the head of that company actually created a business development function to allow them to explore various ideas. And he had a 3-element process: materials, try new materials, try to incubate, and try to transfer. And they went through a 10 or 15-year period of driving that, and they ended up going from glass to applications of different materials, including even life sciences. And they were able to make that transition. And that is sort of an example of retaining process discipline, but allowing for exploration, which is very interesting.
Is there a component of this, Mike, that while we're speaking about this in the business perspective, that this is also to a degree a cultural change in terms of how Japan views itself and what it should be in the decades ahead?
It's a great point in the sense that as we went into the study, just by way of a context here, we didn't have any priors as to of what was happening or why it should be happening or what kind of changes were underway. But we discovered in talking with people, say at the head of this glass company or at Mitsubishi or Nissan and well beyond, that a number of the top managers in these firms were kind of coming to terms with the fact that their stock price has been down, their earnings have been off, and they're really going to have to reinvent themselves. And that, in our view, is the driver, is a number of people, some already in office, some brought into office with the support of their board. And by the way, Japanese governance changing along with top management and its attitude about this, saying, look, the old ways of running firms worked very well back in the 70s and 80s, but they're doing very poorly in a much more competitive global market. And therefore, they said, we've really got to help people working for us rethink what they're doing and how they're doing it, moving away from lifetime employment, for example, or the assumption that once you're there at a given company, you're going to be there for life, and it's just a matter of kind of regular upward procession. Many of the people we talk with said that they began that way in their own career, but they came to appreciate that if they didn't get the people working for them to really focus on what the market was doing and getting rid of some old business that was no longer all that competitive, and appreciating that new methods of manufacturing, new materials, new products were going to be important, they set about a long remake, and the remake we describe in the book actually probably goes back at least 5 or 10 years, and in part because, back to your initial point, Dan, because the culture ultimately has had to be changed as part of everything else. So a new focus on talent and its development, as opposed to taking for granted that people who are hired in by you are going to do well, they don't need a lot of coaching. A different attitude about the role of top management. In a nutshell, the old method of speaking from on high, if you were a CEO, and everybody's going to hear and apply what you want them to do in their own work life, no longer was working. And so the culture change now that is underlying all that we've said, the 4 particular points that Harbir referenced up earlier, we think is the fundamental platform by which Japan resolutely is coming back from the disaster it faced.
So how are we starting to see then those 4 points play out, Harbir, in terms of the corporations that are trying to lead this comeback right now?
So one of the most fundamental things that we see among the leaders is that they're actually instilling a sense of vision that is kind of a wider aperture. It's not just that particular business, not just the product. It is kind of a set of services, a set of new knowledge that they're trying to develop. Then also there's a sense of going beyond the traditional hierarchy, creating a greater element of informality. Interestingly, they have a lot of town meetings, the most successful, because you need to mobilize people, Sure. So they're almost walking, and kind of walking around in shirt sleeves with a microphone in hand, not sitting at a table and then broadcasting the message. Yeah. So there's a sense of activism, a sense of momentum, inspiration, and then also accompanying that a sense of processes and incentives and so on. And the other point that's very interesting is, as Mike mentioned, the talent part. They tend to retain talent. They of course shut down factories. They lose talent in those situations, but they've learned how to redeploy talent. And there's a lot we can learn in our context. And it's because they have a longer time horizon to build businesses. They're a little more patient with capital in their business. So they're retaining some of the traditional Japanese skills, but modifying them.
So off of something that Mike said, I think it's interesting that component of, hearing the message from on high, and it being passed down to the employees, and the employees just implement it. That's unique to see that change because of how historical that is within the culture of business within Japan.
Exactly. In fact, they even said that in some cases they used to have meetings with seating charts, and they got rid of the seating chart. So it was kind of a level of formality that is beyond anything you might imagine. And one of the leaders actually said that he used to to convey the sense of approachability. He said, I'm the one who takes out the garbage, it's sort of, you have to say, I'm every man, every person, and metaphorically he was saying all of us need to do that, all of us need to be in charge of our own situation. And that I think was fascinating. That was in fact Mr. Kazuo Hirai from Sony. And he led a 10 or 12 year horizon of changing Sony's portfolio. Sony was struggling a lot, when Apple began to dominate consumer electronics, and they were not doing well so much in the movie production business. They had to change their whole portfolio of businesses. So I think that's an example. Now, it's only about a third of the companies that have been able to do that. That's also interesting, and then I think they're the leaders, and we're presuming the others might follow.
Well, I was going to say, is the landscape open to making change right now more reticently than maybe it was, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago?
I think it definitely is. Mike and I remember, the early start of this work stages and seeing a sense of, some despondency that, for so many years the economy has remained stagnant. Right. And I think a sense of urgency. So I think there's a context in society where you start seeing working examples and people start emulating those.
How do you think then, when you think about leadership of what these companies were, and now what it is and what it could potentially be, it almost feels a little bit like you're seeing a shift, a movement to a degree. This will play out probably generationally with the leaders that'll be there 20 years down the road of what these companies and what the expectations of the leaders will be in the next couple of decades.
Well, to speak to that, I think Harbir and our colleague in Japan concluded after talking with 102 of these people at the top of the chart, chief executives, board chairs, and so on, that this has an amazing amount of momentum. It's happening. It's going to, I think, play out over the next 5 or 10 years. And even more importantly, from our standpoint, what's developing now in Japan, we think is worth thinking about, even if you're not running a company in Japan, right, in that they've invented, we tend to call it a bit of a hybrid. They've kept some of the old methods that work very well, the people at the top of of these organizational charts, but they've also, take one particular point here to make the point, they've also added in sort of new pieces to how they do it. For example, not sitting in the high castle and casting or pushing directives down, but actually getting out of your castle and walking around and talking with people. So we think longer term that what's happening in Japan, it is a kind of a quiet, largely unseen revolution in how business is getting business done, that is responding to changes in the workplace and the competition these companies are. And we think we can, in a sense, see some of our own future in looking at Japan.
What do you think is then the potential economic benefit of having this style of leadership, this change? I mean, obviously, a lot of these companies have been successful for such a long period of time, going through the down cycles that they did, but still they're well-known, well-understood companies and brands. What does it mean for their fiscal outlook moving forward?
I think that's a very, very interesting question. I think what it really says is that those who have been able to adapt see a very positive horizon, and others have a sense of urgency to sort of retire some of the the legacy assets and move forward. And they've also seen a kind of a less stressful way of doing that, but a longer time. So they're understanding the hybrid model. So we think this hybrid model will actually diffuse through the economy. There are some structural elements that are still a problem. It's hard to reduce employment in Japan. There are demographic challenges in Japan as well, and not much immigrant labor coming in. So they are really looking at the high-tech, high-value-added services. And in that, I think they are doing very, very well.
Mike?
Yeah, I'll offer up an illustration of the same from the low-tech world. In Japan, there's a chain that's very much like 7-Eleven over here called Lawson. Mm-hmm. By the way, 7-Eleven is also Japanese-owned, not appreciated by most Americans. And at Lawson, the new chief executive came in some years ago, not so new at this moment, took the view that the way that Lawson had traditionally run its 15,000 stores all across Japan, these convenience stores, is to say, look, you got to stock the following items, and you've got to follow the rules coming out of headquarters down here in Tokyo. The new guy that came in for us, kind of a paradigm of what this shift means, has said that that's a little bit nuts in that local needs are different. There are a bunch of Lawson stores, for example, up near the Fukushima area where we had this nuclear disaster now going back after the tsunami going back about 14 or 15 years. And he said to the stores, think through what people need in your area. What people needed was water, for example. They needed food, which these local stores didn't have so much of. And he just simply said, figure it out. Look at your customers. What do they need? You're hereby delegated to be your own leader, so to speak. Yeah. So we believe that this form of delegation, intent clear, but delegation of authority to make on the battlefield decisions is a good idea. It's here to stay. It's helped turn around the stock market in Japan, which is now way, way up. That's why some large investors, including Warren Buffett, are increasingly looking to invest in Japan. Quick summary point is this kind of quiet revolution behind the scenes along the lines that Harbir outlined there at the very start is happening. We think it's here to stay. We think other companies are going to pick it up. We think it's worthwhile. If you're running a company in Japan, India, North America, Brazil, Europe, it's a good idea to take a look at what's happening in Japan because in some respects, I think it's our own future as well.
Do the challenges then, are they there as well if you're taking these ideas and going to other cultures because they will have, similarly to what Japan has had for a long time, they will have their own philosophies on how to lead, how to run companies, and what they believe is successful, and how receptive do you think they will be to bringing these ideas in?
It's a great question, and I think just to pick up on that, and Harbir, over to you, and that is, I think Harbir and I and our third colleague in Japan have independently come to the conclusion that one of the best ways to evolve your own leadership is look around other companies in the U.S., other companies in Brazil or China or Japan. And many of these Japanese companies, to us anyway, are kind of creating the future, not only for them, but a future that we can see through them that may be our own future. So that's why we wrote the book, wanted to tell the story in Japan. People in Japan know the story, so this is really not for people who are living it. It really is for people who want to think about their own leadership, their own firm, and how they too, just like these Japanese, turnaround, resolute new leaders in Japan have turned around many companies there. We think that some of our future is seen now in Japan. Thus, good to take a look at what Japanese companies are doing. We think it's the future.
Harbir?
So, in fact, one of the big debates in the U.S. today is the issue of shareholder value and purpose, right? That shareholder value has a primacy, and very often people allude to that and say, therefore, we are shutting down these divisions and so on. And at the same time, in many of our corporations here, there's a sense of the pursuit of purpose as a way of, attracting people and giving them something that they can be motivated by. I think the Japanese model we have here, the hybrid model, actually has a very good sort of example on the firm's role in society and kind of seamlessly working with, consumers, employees, and communities. And that's a well-established tradition. And I think with about half or more of the Fortune 500 trying to follow purpose with mixed results, there's actually a transferable model from these companies that we have studied to our corporations over here.
Great to have you both here with us today. Thanks very much. Harbir, Mike, great to see you again.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. The book is titled Resolute Japan, The Leaders Forging a Corporate Resurgence. And pleasure to have two of the authors with us here in the studio today, Harbir Singh and Mike Useem, along with their cohort, JJ Ikegami.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.